Kieran sat at his desk and stared at the blue screen in front of him. The morning light from Velthara Prime's twin suns came through the tall windows of the Intelligence Division building. He took a sip of his bitter morning drink and waited for his assignment to load. The building was quiet except for the soft hum of computers and the distant sound of ships landing at the spaceport. Kieran liked the early morning hours. Most of his coworkers were still sleeping and he could think clearly without interruptions. His screen beeped. A new message appeared with a red priority mark. Kieran opened it and saw it was from General Thane Mortis himself. That was unusual. The general usually sent assignments through lower officers. Analyst Kieran Veltek, the message began. Report to my office at 800 hours. Priority assignment awaits. Classified level 7. Kieran looked at the time. He had 30 minutes. He finished his drink quickly and walked through the empty hallways to the general's office on the top floor. General Mortis was a large Velthari with dark gray skin and the traditional military scars across his forehead. He had conquered more worlds than any other general in the Empire's history. When Kieran entered, the general was standing by a huge window that showed the entire capital city below. "Sit down, analyst," the general said without turning around. "I have a job for you." Kieran sat in the chair across from the general's desk. The office was full of trophies from conquered worlds. Strange weapons hung on the walls. Flags from defeated armies were displayed in glass cases. "We are planning our next expansion," General Mortis said, finally turning to face Kieran. "A small blue planet in the outer rim. The locals call it Earth." Kieran nodded. He had heard rumors about Earth. It was supposed to be an easy target. The humans who lived there had primitive technology and were always fighting among themselves. "Your job is simple," the general continued. "I need a complete analysis of their military capabilities. How they fight, how they think, what makes them surrender. The usual report." The general handed Kieran a data pad. "You have 3 months. The invasion fleet launches after that. I want to know everything about these humans before we arrive." Kieran took the data pad and stood up. "Yes, sir." "How many troops will we need for the invasion?" General Mortis smiled. It was not a kind smile. "Our previous conquests needed between 50,000 and 200,000 troops. For Earth, I am thinking maybe 100,000 should be enough. These humans seem weak and divided. I will give you the exact numbers in my report, sir." "Good. You can access all intercepted communications, surveillance data, and historical records. Everything we know about Earth is in the main database." Kieran saluted and left the office. He walked back to his desk, feeling confident. This was exactly the kind of work he was good at. He had written similar reports for 6 other worlds. Each time his analysis had been perfect. The invasions had gone exactly as he predicted. He plugged the datapad into his computer and started downloading files. The Earth database was much larger than he expected. Humans had been broadcasting signals into space for over a century. The Velthari had been listening and recording everything. The first files were basic information. Earth had 7 billion humans living on one planet. They were divided into many different countries and spoke hundreds of languages. They fought wars over resources, land, and ideas. So far, everything seemed normal. Kieran opened a file labeled Recent Military Conflicts. He expected to see simple territorial disputes like most primitive species had. What he found was more complex. The humans had fought 2 massive wars that involved almost their entire planet. They called them world wars. Millions of humans had died in each one. But what interested Kieran was how quickly they had recovered. After each war, they became more advanced, not weaker. He opened another file about something called the Korean War. This had happened on a peninsula in a place called Asia. 2 groups of humans had fought for 3 years over political ideas. The strange thing was that other humans from completely different continents had traveled across space to join the fight. Kieran read about soldiers with names like Corporal Jae-hoon Park and Private Dongmin Lee. These humans had fought in terrible cold and against overwhelming numbers, but they had not given up. Even when their situation was hopeless, they kept fighting. This was puzzling. In every other species the Velthari had studied, soldiers surrendered when defeat was certain. It was logical. Why die for nothing? But these humans seemed to think differently. He opened a video file from something called the Battle of Heartbreak Ridge. The recording was fuzzy and old, but he could see human soldiers fighting against much larger numbers. They were running out of ammunition and supplies. Many were wounded. By all logical standards, they should have surrendered. Instead, they fought harder. Kieran watched as a human medic named So-Jin Kim ran across open ground under enemy fire to help wounded soldiers. She was hit twice but kept going. When she finally reached the wounded, she treated them while bullets flew around her. This made no sense. Why risk valuable medical personnel for soldiers who might die anyway? It was inefficient and illogical. He opened more files. Human after human showed the same pattern. Sergeant Hyun-Soo Nam had held his position alone for 6 hours after his unit retreated. Lieutenant Min Kyung-oh had carried wounded soldiers to safety instead of advancing with the attack. Kieran rubbed his eyes and looked at the time. He had been reading for 8 hours without stopping. His head was starting to hurt. These humans were not behaving like any enemy he had studied before. Most species had clear breaking points. Apply enough pressure, cause enough casualties, and they would surrender. It was a mathematical equation. But these Korean war files suggested that humans might not follow normal patterns. He decided to read about their weapons next. Maybe they had some secret technology that made them confident. The files showed basic chemical explosives, metal projectiles, and simple vehicles. Nothing that could threaten Velthari energy weapons or force shields. But then he found something strange. The humans had developed nuclear weapons during their World War II. These were powerful enough to destroy entire cities. They had actually used them in war, killing hundreds of thousands of their own species. What shocked Kieran was what happened next. Instead of using these weapons to conquer the world, the humans had spent decades trying to control them. They made treaties to limit nuclear weapons. They shared the technology with potential enemies instead of keeping it secret. This was completely illogical. If the Velthari had such weapons, they would use them to conquer the galaxy. Why would the humans hold back? Kieran saved his work and walked to the window. The suns were setting, painting the sky orange and purple. He could see the shipyards in the distance where the invasion fleet was being prepared. Something was bothering him about the human files, but he could not figure out what it was. On the surface, they looked like any other primitive species. But there were these strange patterns that did not make sense. He thought about Corporal Jae-hoon Park again. The man had been surrounded by enemies and low on ammunition. Instead of surrendering, he had called down artillery fire on his own position. He died, but he took 30 enemies with him. Why would someone do that? What could be worth dying for? Kieran shook his head. He was probably reading too much into it. Every species had a few crazy individuals who did irrational things. It did not mean the whole population was like that. He gathered his files and headed home. Tomorrow he would dig deeper into human psychology and find their breaking point. Every species had one. Humans would be no different. But as he walked through the empty streets, Kieran could not shake the feeling that he was missing something important. Something that might change everything about the upcoming invasion. The human files felt different from all the others. There was something in them that made him uncomfortable, though he could not say what it was. He would figure it out tomorrow. He had to. The invasion fleet was depending on his analysis, and Kieran had never been wrong before. He just hoped the humans would be as simple to understand as every other species had been. Kieran arrived at work early again, but this time he felt uneasy. The human files from yesterday had given him strange dreams. He kept seeing images of soldiers fighting in impossible situations, never giving up even when death was certain. He opened his computer and went back to the Earth database. Today he wanted to focus on specific battles to understand human tactics better. Maybe if he studied their methods closely, he could find their weaknesses. He started with a conflict called the Vietnam War. Humans from a place called America had fought against humans from Vietnam for many years. The American forces had better weapons, more supplies, and control of the air. They should have won easily, but they did not. Kieran read about Vietnamese soldiers like Sergeant Dae-ho Kim and Private Min-soo Park. These men had lived in underground tunnels for months, coming out only to attack and then disappearing again. They ate very little food and had basic weapons, but they never stopped fighting. The Americans had dropped more bombs on Vietnam than they had used in their entire World War II. They had killed hundreds of thousands of Vietnamese soldiers. But somehow the Vietnamese kept fighting. They even got stronger. This made no sense to Kieran. In any logical military situation, massive bombing should break the enemy's will to fight. Heavy casualties should force surrender, but the Vietnamese had done the opposite. The more they were attacked, the harder they fought. He found a report written by an American general. The man was frustrated and confused. He wrote, "We are fighting an enemy that does not seem to understand when they are beaten. They lose every major battle but somehow keep winning the war." Kieran read this sentence 3 times. How could someone lose battles but win wars? It was like saying water flowed uphill. He opened another file about a Vietnamese officer named Captain So Young Lee. She had led a unit of 40 soldiers against an American base defended by 300 troops. The logical thing would have been to avoid the base or wait for reinforcements. Instead, Captain Lee had attacked at night during a thunderstorm. Her soldiers had crawled through mud and wire for hours to reach the enemy. They knew most of them would die. They attacked anyway. The report said that Captain Lee's unit had destroyed the base's communications and supply depot before being killed. The 40 Vietnamese soldiers had done more damage than some American units 10 times their size. But why? What made them willing to die for such a small advantage? Kieran rubbed his temples. A headache was starting behind his eyes. He decided to look at a different war, hoping to find more normal patterns. He opened files about something called the Korean War again. This time he focused on a battle at a place called Chosin Reservoir. It had happened in winter, with temperatures cold enough to freeze exposed skin in minutes. Human forces from many countries had been trapped by Chinese and Korean armies. They were outnumbered 5-1 and running out of supplies. The logical choice was surrender. Instead, they had fought their way out through 70 miles of enemy territory. Kieran read the account of Corporal Hyun-woo Choi. The man had carried a wounded friend on his back for 3 days through enemy lines. Both men should have died from cold and exhaustion. When rescue forces found them, Corporal Choi was unconscious but still holding his friend. The wounded soldier had been dead for 2 days. Corporal Choi had carried a corpse for 40 miles rather than leave his friend behind. This was completely irrational. Carrying extra weight had put both men in more danger. But Corporal Choi had refused to abandon someone who was already dead. Kieran stood up and walked around his office. His hands were shaking slightly. These humans were not following any logical military principles. They were doing things that should be impossible. He sat back down and opened another file. This one was about a human named Lieutenant Yoonji Nam. She had been defending a hill position with 12 soldiers when 500 enemy troops attacked. The normal response would be immediate retreat. Lieutenant Nam had ordered her soldiers to fall back while she stayed alone with one machine gun. She held the position for 6 hours, killing dozens of attackers. When reinforcements finally arrived, they found her body surrounded by empty ammunition boxes. She had died for 12 soldiers and a worthless hill, but her sacrifice had allowed those 12 men to warn a larger force about the enemy attack. Because of her death, 3,000 soldiers had escaped a trap. One human had died to save 3,000 others. The mathematics worked, but Kieran could not understand the thinking. How could someone choose certain death for people they barely knew? He opened his lunch and tried to eat, but the food tasted like sand. The human files were affecting his appetite. He kept thinking about Lieutenant Nam facing 500 enemies alone. The afternoon files were worse. Kieran read about human medics who ran into gunfire to help wounded enemies. He found reports of soldiers sharing their food with prisoners when they were starving themselves. There were accounts of humans risking execution to hide civilians from their own armies. None of this made sense. In war, you protected your own forces and destroyed the enemy. You did not waste resources helping people who were trying to kill you. But humans seemed to have different rules. He found a recording of a human soldier named Sergeant Miran Lim. She was talking to someone back home through a radio. The quality was poor, but Kieran could understand most of the words. "We lost 8 men today," Sergeant Lim said. Her voice was tired and sad. "But we saved a village full of children. The kids gave us flowers before we left. I think that makes it worth it. 8 trained soldiers for some civilian children. By any military calculation, this was a terrible trade. Soldiers took years to train and cost enormous resources. Children could be replaced easily. But Sergeant Lim sounded like she believed the trade was fair." Kieran closed that file and opened another. This one was about humans fighting on islands in something called the Pacific War. Japanese humans had defended small pieces of rock and sand against American humans. Both sides had died in enormous numbers for places that had no real value. On an island called Iwo Jima, 20,000 Japanese soldiers had fought against 60,000 Americans. The Japanese knew they could not win. They had no way to escape and no hope of reinforcement. Logic said they should surrender. Instead, they had built underground fortresses and fought for every inch of ground. It took the Americans 36 days to capture an island that was only 8 square miles. When it was over, almost all the Japanese were dead. But they had killed or wounded 28,000 Americans. They had turned certain defeat into enormous cost for the enemy. Kieran read the account of a Japanese officer named Captain Woo Jin-ha. He had commanded the last position on the island. When American soldiers finally reached him, he was alone and badly wounded. He had 1 bullet left in his pistol. Instead of surrendering or killing himself, Captain Ha had used his last bullet to destroy a radio that contained military codes. He died protecting information that might save other Japanese forces. 1 man, 1 bullet, 1 choice. He had chosen to help soldiers he would never meet rather than save his own life. The pattern was everywhere. Humans consistently chose death over surrender. They sacrificed themselves for strangers. They fought harder when the situation became more hopeless. This was the opposite of every rational military behavior. It was like they became more dangerous when they were losing. Kieran looked at his computer screen and realized he had been reading for 10 hours straight. The office was dark except for his desk lamp. Everyone else had gone home hours ago. He saved his files and turned off the computer, but he could not stop thinking about the humans. Every story he read made them seem more alien, not less. Captain Ha could have lived if he had just dropped his weapon. Lieutenant Nam could have retreated with her soldiers. Sergeant Lim could have let the civilians find their own safety, but they had all chosen differently. They had chosen death for the sake of people they barely knew or had never met. As Kieran walked home through the empty streets, he wondered what kind of species thought like that. What made humans value abstract ideas more than their own lives? He tried to imagine himself in Captain Ha's position. Would he use his last bullet to destroy information, or would he try to negotiate for his life? Kieran knew the answer, and it made him uncomfortable. Any rational person would try to survive. That was basic biology. Self-preservation was the strongest instinct in every intelligent species, except apparently in humans. When he reached his apartment, Kieran sat by the window and looked up at the stars. Somewhere out there was a small blue planet full of creatures that did not think like any other species in the galaxy. The invasion fleet was being prepared to fight an enemy that the Velthari did not understand. General Mortis was planning for a normal war against a normal enemy. But Kieran was beginning to suspect that humans were not normal at all. Tomorrow he would dig deeper. He would find the explanation for this strange behavior. There had to be a logical reason why humans acted this way. There had to be. Kieran had not slept well. His dreams were full of human soldiers who smiled while they died. He kept seeing Captain Ha's face as he used his last bullet for others instead of himself. When he woke up, his sheets were soaked with sweat. He arrived at work feeling sick. The morning drink tasted bitter, and his hand shook as he turned on his computer. He had 2 months left to finish his report, but already he was dreading what he might find. Today he decided to study human behavior in their most desperate situations. If he could understand how they broke under extreme pressure, maybe he could find their weaknesses. He opened files about human prisoners of war. Every species had limits to what they could endure. Pain, isolation, and psychological pressure eventually broke everyone. The Velthari had perfected methods to make any enemy surrender. But the human files were different. Kieran read about a pilot named Colonel Jae-min Yoon, who had been captured during something called the Korean War. He had been held prisoner for 3 years. His captors had tortured him, starved him, and tried to break his mind with propaganda. Colonel Yoon had not broken. Instead, he had organized other prisoners into a secret resistance network inside the prison camp. He had helped dozens of men escape and maintained military discipline even in captivity. When he was finally released, Colonel Yoon was asked how he had survived. His answer made Kieran's blood run cold. I remembered that my country was counting on me to come home with honor. Death was easier than disappointing them. This human had chosen 3 years of torture over betraying people who might never know what he had suffered. He had endured unimaginable pain for abstract concepts like honor and duty. Kieran opened another file about a female prisoner named Captain Young-Soo Park. She had been shot down, over enemy territory and captured with a broken leg and severe burns. For 2 years, her captors had tried to make her reveal military secrets. They had beaten her daily. They had denied her medical treatment until infections nearly killed her. They had shown her false evidence that her family was dead and her country had forgotten her. Captain Park had never given them any useful information. She had spent her time teaching other prisoners how to resist interrogation and maintain hope. When rescue forces finally found the prison camp, she was helping a wounded enemy soldier who had tried to protect her from the guards. She was helping her own torturer. Kieran stared at the screen in disbelief. This human had been brutalized for 2 years, and her response was to show mercy to her abuser. What kind of mind worked that way? He opened more files, hoping to find normal breaking points. Instead, he found story after story of humans who became stronger under pressure. There was Sergeant Haiwan Shin, who had coordinated civilian evacuations while under constant artillery fire. She had stayed at her post for 18 hours straight, guiding thousands of people to safety while bombs exploded around her. When someone asked why she did not evacuate with the others, she had said, "Someone has to be the last one out. It might as well be me." She had volunteered to face death alone so that strangers could live. Kieran found records of human pilots who had crashed their planes into enemy ships rather than let them escape. There were accounts of soldiers who had thrown themselves on explosives to protect their friends. He read about medics who had died treating wounded enemies during ceasefires. Every file showed the same pattern. When humans were pushed to their limits, they did not break. They made choices that defied all logic and self-preservation. But the worst discovery came when Kieran started reading about something humans called total war. During their World War II, humans had developed a concept that terrified him. Instead of fighting armies, they had begun fighting entire civilizations. They had targeted not just military forces, but the enemy's ability to make war at all. Kieran read about cities burned to the ground. He found accounts of industrial centers destroyed completely. There were records of transportation networks bombed until nothing could move. The humans had not just wanted to defeat their enemies. They had wanted to make sure their enemies could never fight again. But what shocked Kieran most was that humans had done this to themselves. They had destroyed their own cities rather than let enemies capture them. They had burned their own crops rather than let invaders eat them. He found a report about the Soviet Union during the German invasion. As German armies advanced, Soviet humans had destroyed everything useful in their path. They had blown up their own bridges, burned their own food supplies, and evacuated entire cities. The policy was called scorched earth. Leave nothing for the enemy except ash and ruins. Soviet officer named General Dong-hyun Kim had written, "If we cannot have our homeland, then no one can have it. We will turn our country into a graveyard before we let fascists live in our homes." They had been willing to destroy everything they loved rather than let enemies enjoy it. Kieran stood up and walked to the bathroom. He felt like he was going to be sick. These humans were not just irrational. They were willing to turn warfare into mutual annihilation. When he returned to his desk, he forced himself to keep reading. He had to understand the full scope of what the Velthari were planning to fight. He found files about human resistance movements. Even after armies were defeated and governments had surrendered, individual humans continued fighting. They formed secret groups that attacked occupying forces for years or even decades. In a place called France, humans had fought against German occupation for 4 years after their official surrender. They had sabotaged railways, assassinated collaborators, and gathered intelligence for Allied forces. Many of these resistance fighters were not soldiers. They were farmers, teachers, shopkeepers, and students. But they had chosen to risk everything rather than live under foreign rule. Kieran read about a resistance leader named Marie Soo-jin Park. She had been a school teacher before the war. After the occupation began, she had organized a network that helped Allied soldiers escape and gathered information about enemy movements. She had been captured and executed, but her network had continued operating. Her students had taken over her work and expanded it. By the time the occupation ended, thousands of ordinary humans had joined the resistance. They had not fought for money or power. They had fought for the idea that their homeland belonged to them, not to foreign conquerors. This was the most frightening discovery yet. Even if the Velthari defeated human armies and destroyed human governments, Individual humans would keep fighting. They would never accept occupation as permanent. Kieran opened files about human behavior in occupied territories. The pattern was always the same. At first there would be cooperation and submission, but gradually resistance would grow. Humans would start with small acts of defiance. They would ignore orders, work slowly, or hide supplies. Over time, these small acts would grow into organized rebellion. The key was that humans seemed to view occupation as temporary, no matter how hopeless their situation appeared. They always believed that eventually they would be free again. He found a quote from a human named Dr. Young-E Ko, who had lived under occupation for 5 years. "They can control our bodies, but they cannot control our minds. Every day we resist is a victory. Every day we survive is a promise to future generations that freedom will return." Future generations. Humans fought not just for themselves, but for children who had not even been born yet. Kieran realized with growing horror that humans viewed war in completely different terms than any other species. For most races, war was about immediate survival or territorial control. When you lost, you submitted and tried to minimize further damage. But humans seemed to view war as a generational struggle. They fought for abstract ideas that would outlive them. They made sacrifices for people they would never meet. This meant that defeating humans militarily would not end the conflict. It would only change the nature of the fighting. As the day wore on, Kieran found more evidence of human persistence. They had never accepted permanent defeat. Every conquest in their history had eventually been reversed. Every occupation had eventually ended. The Roman Empire had fallen. The Mongol Empire had crumbled. The Third Reich had been destroyed. Colonial empires had collapsed. No matter how powerful the conqueror, humans had eventually found a way to regain their freedom. By evening, Kieran's head was pounding. He had discovered something that changed everything about the planned invasion. The Velthari were not planning to fight a war. They were planning to start a conflict that could last for generations. Even if they won every battle, humans would never stop fighting back. And the longer the conflict continued, the more dangerous humans would become. They would learn Velthari tactics, adapt to Velthari technology, and develop new methods of resistance. Kieran thought about the invasion fleet being prepared in orbit. 100,000 soldiers seemed like a massive force, but now he wondered if it would be enough. How many soldiers would it take to control 7 billion humans who refused to accept defeat? How many troops would be needed to watch every city, every village, every farm? And what would happen when human children grew up under occupation? Would they accept Velthari rule, or would they continue their parents' fight? Kieran already knew the answer. Human children would remember. They would grow up planning revenge. Kieran had stopped eating regular meals. Food tasted like ash in his mouth. He spent his days reading human files and his nights staring at the ceiling, unable to sleep. The invasion was only 3 weeks away, and every new discovery made it seem more like a disaster. This morning he had decided to study human learning patterns during warfare. Maybe they were slow to adapt. Maybe their emotional responses made them poor at tactical evolution. He needed to find something that showed human weakness. What he found was worse than anything before. Humans did not just learn from their own mistakes. They learned from everyone's mistakes. They studied every war, every battle, every tactical innovation in their history. Each generation of human soldiers was more effective than the last. Kieran opened files about human military academies. These were schools where they taught young humans how to fight. But unlike Velthari military training, which focused on current tactics and weapons, human education covered thousands of years of warfare. A human officer named General Tae-jun-oh had written, "We study the battles of ancient Rome so we do not repeat the mistakes of Caesar. We analyze the campaigns of Napoleon so we understand the limits of empire. We examine every defeat in our history so we never lose the same way twice." Human soldiers learned not just from their own experience, but from the experience of every human who had ever fought. They carried the accumulated knowledge of their entire species into each new conflict. This was terrifying. The Velthari had conquered 17 worlds using the same basic tactics. They relied on superior technology and overwhelming force. It had worked every time because primitive species could not adapt quickly enough. But humans had been preparing for war for their entire history. They had already thought about how to fight enemies with superior technology. They had developed tactics for fighting when outnumbered and outgunned. Kieran found human military manuals that discussed exactly this situation. They called it asymmetric warfare. The idea was to avoid direct confrontation with superior forces while attacking weaknesses and supply lines. One manual had been written by a human strategist named Colonel Jinna Seo. She had studied how primitive armies had defeated advanced civilizations throughout history. Her conclusions were chilling. Technology is an advantage, not a guarantee, she had written. Superior forces can be defeated if the enemy refuses to fight on your terms. Make the war costly, make it personal, and make it last longer than the enemy can sustain. Make it last longer than the enemy can sustain. Kieran realized that humans had already figured out how to defeat the Velthari. They would not try to win battles. They would try to make the war so expensive and painful that the Velthari would eventually leave. He opened more files about human resistance tactics. They had perfected methods of fighting occupying armies that seemed designed specifically to counter Velthari advantages. Humans would hide among civilian populations, making it impossible to target them without killing innocents. They would attack supply convoys rather than military bases, forcing the Velthari to guard everything. They would use captured weapons and technology, turning Velthari advantages against them. Most frightening of all, they would make every Velthari death costly and personal. Kieran found a resistance manual written during the human occupation of a place called Afghanistan. The author was a fighter named Commander Wu Jin Ha. His tactics were simple but devastating. Do not fight to win battles, he had written. Fight to make the enemy afraid. Make them paranoid. Make them see enemies everywhere. Turn their strength into weakness by forcing them to guard everything and trust no one. The manual described methods of psychological warfare that made Kieran's skin crawl. Humans would booby-trap their own belongings so occupying soldiers could not safely touch anything. They would poison food supplies and sabotage equipment. They would attack when enemies felt safest. But the worst part was how humans dealt with captured soldiers. Kieran had expected to find evidence of torture or execution. Instead, he found something much more disturbing. Humans often treated prisoners well, giving them medical care and food, while slowly convincing them that the war was wrong. There were accounts of Velthari-like situations where captured soldiers had eventually joined their captors. They had been convinced that they were fighting for the wrong side. Commander Ha had written, "A dead enemy soldier is replaced by his government. A converted enemy soldier becomes our ally and tells others why they should stop fighting. Which is more valuable?" Humans were not just planning to fight Velthari soldiers. They were planning to turn them against their own people. Kieran found case studies of this happening throughout human history. During their Vietnam War, American soldiers had sometimes defected to the Vietnamese side. During World War II, German soldiers had joined resistance movements in occupied countries. If humans could convince their own species to switch sides, what would they do to alien invaders who were obviously in the wrong? The thought made Kieran sick. He imagined Velthari soldiers questioning their orders, refusing to fight, or even helping human resistance movements. The invasion could collapse from within, but even worse discoveries awaited him in the afternoon files. Kieran had decided to study human nuclear weapons to understand their potential for mass destruction. What he found was not just weapons technology, but a philosophy of warfare that defied all rational thought. Humans had developed something called mutually assured destruction. If they were attacked with nuclear weapons, they would respond with nuclear weapons of their own. Both sides would be destroyed completely. This was insane. No rational species would choose mutual annihilation over survival, but humans had built their entire defense strategy around this concept. They would rather die than lose, Kieran read statements from human leaders during something called the Cold War. They had been prepared to destroy their entire planet rather than accept conquest by their enemies. One human president had said, "We will never surrender our freedom, even if defending it means the end of civilization. Better to die as free humans than live as slaves. Better to die as free humans than live as slaves." These words echoed in Kieran's mind as he continued reading. Humans had actually planned for planetary suicide rather than occupation. They had built weapons capable of making their entire world uninhabitable, and they had been serious about using them. During various crises, human leaders had come close to launching nuclear wars that would have killed everyone on Earth. They had been willing to commit species suicide to prevent their enemies from winning. This was beyond irrational. This was a level of determination that bordered on madness. Kieran found himself shaking as he read more files. Humans had contingency plans for every possible invasion scenario. If enemy forces landed, they would destroy their own infrastructure, rather than let it be used against them. If their cities were captured, they would turn them into uninhabitable ruins. If their planet was conquered, they would make it worthless to the conquerors. He read about something called dead man switches, weapon systems that would activate automatically if human leadership was killed. Even in death, humans had planned to continue fighting. One military planner named Dr. Soo-Jin Park had designed a system that would contaminate water supplies and destroy food production if sensors detected foreign occupation. She had written, "If we cannot live in freedom, we will make sure no one can live here at all." The humans were prepared to turn Earth into a poisoned wasteland rather than let aliens enjoy their conquest. As evening approached, Kieran made his most horrifying discovery yet. He found files about human space programs. They had been quietly developing the ability to leave their planet and spread throughout the galaxy. If Earth was conquered, humans would simply continue the war from other worlds. But more than that, they had been preparing for exactly this scenario. Human scientists had been discussing what to do if hostile aliens invaded Earth. Their plans were not defensive. They were offensive. If aliens conquered Earth, humans would spend however long it took to develop superior technology. Then they would track down the home worlds of their conquerors and destroy them completely. They called it species vengeance. The idea was that any alien race that destroyed humanity would eventually be wiped out in return, even if it took centuries. One human scientist named Dr. Dong-Hyun Kim had written, "We may not be able to save ourselves, but we can make sure our killers pay the ultimate price. Future human generations will hunt down every member of any species that destroys Earth. We will make genocide, a crime that destroys the perpetrator, humans. We're planning to kill entire alien civilizations in revenge for conquering Earth." They would turn interstellar war into a genocide competition. Kieran stood up from his desk and walked to the window. His hands were trembling so badly he could barely hold his coffee cup. Below him, the Veltari capital continued its normal routine. People walked to work, children played in parks, families enjoyed peaceful evenings. None of them knew that their government was about to start a war with creatures who would never forgive and never forget. If the invasion proceeded, it would not end with the conquest of Earth. It would end with the destruction of Velthara Prime. Maybe not next year, maybe not in this century, but eventually, humans would come for them. Kieran had not left his office in 2 days. He slept on the floor and ate emergency rations from the supply cabinet. The invasion fleet would launch tomorrow morning, and he had one night to write the most important report in Velthari history. His computer screen glowed in the darkness, showing the final human file he needed to review. This one was different from all the others. It was not about war or death or sacrifice. It was about something that might be even more dangerous. The file contained recordings of human music, art, and literature created during their darkest moments. Humans who were facing death had spent their final hours creating beauty, instead of seeking revenge. Kieran played a recording of a human named Soo-Jin Park. She had been trapped in a burning building during a bombing raid. Instead of panicking, she had sung lullabies to comfort frightened children until rescue workers arrived. She had died in the collapse, but her voice had given hope to others in their final moments. Another recording showed a human soldier named Jin Woo Lee writing poetry in a foxhole during artillery bombardment. He had composed verses about the beauty of his homeland while explosions shook the ground around him. He had died that night, but his poems had been found and shared with thousands of other soldiers. This was what truly terrified Kieran about humans. They were not just warriors who refused to surrender. They were beings who could find meaning and purpose in the worst circumstances imaginable. They could turn suffering into art, defeat into inspiration, and death into legend. Any species that fought humans would not just face military resistance. They would face an enemy that could transform every tragedy into a story that inspired future generations to fight harder. Kieran had read enough. He opened a new document and began typing his report. Analysis of Human Military Capabilities. Final report. To General Thane Mortis, from Analyst Kieran Velthek. Classification. Level 7. His fingers paused over the keyboard. How could he explain 3 months of research in a way that would save both species? How could he make the general understand what humans truly were? He started with facts. Initial assessment. Humans possess primitive technology and fragmented political structure. Surface analysis suggests standard occupation protocols would be effective. Detailed analysis. Extended research reveals fundamental differences in human psychology that make standard conquest impossible. Kieran paused again. He could feel sweat on his forehead despite the cool air in the office. What he wrote next would either save or doom 2 civilizations. Primary finding. Humans do not fight wars to win territory or resources. They fight wars to preserve abstract concepts they call freedom and dignity. These concepts are more important to humans than survival itself. Secondary finding. Human resistance increases proportionally to the level of oppression applied. Standard methods of breaking enemy morale will have the opposite effect on human populations. Tertiary finding. Humans view warfare as a generational struggle. Temporary defeat only motivates future revenge. No human conquest in their history has remained permanent. Kieran stopped typing and rubbed his eyes. The words on the screen looked weak compared to what he had learned. How could military language convey the horror of facing an enemy that grew stronger through suffering? He tried a different approach. Strategic implications. Occupying Earth would require permanent military presence of unprecedented scale. Human resistance would continue indefinitely and expand over time. The cost in Velthari lives and resources would eventually exceed any possible benefit. Tactical implications. Humans have already developed strategies specifically designed to defeat technologically superior forces. They will avoid direct confrontation while targeting Velthari weaknesses. Standard Velthari advantages. Technology, training, equipment will be neutralized through asymmetric warfare. Long-term implications. Humans possess spacefaring capability and have contingency plans for species-level revenge. Any conquest of Earth will result in eventual retaliation against Velthara Prime. This retaliation may occur decades or centuries in the future, but human psychology suggests it is inevitable. Kieran read what he had written. It was accurate but incomplete. He had not captured the essential truth about humans. He deleted everything and started over. General Mortis, I have completed my analysis of human military capabilities. My recommendation is immediate cancellation of the invasion of Earth. This is not a tactical assessment. It is a warning about the survival of our species. Humans are not like any enemy we have faced. They do not surrender when defeat is logical. They do not break under pressure. They do not accept occupation as permanent. More importantly, they do not fight for rational reasons. They fight for ideas that we do not understand and cannot counter with military force. I have studied their wars for 3 months. I have read accounts of human soldiers who chose death over surrender, even when surrender would have saved their lives and accomplished their mission. I have found records of humans who helped their own enemies because they believed it was morally correct. These are not the actions of a logical species. These are the actions of beings who value abstract principles more than physical reality. If we invade Earth, we will not face armies. We will face an entire species that views our presence as a violation of their fundamental nature. They will fight us with methods we have never encountered and for reasons we cannot comprehend. They will turn our advantages into disadvantages. They will make our soldiers question their orders. They will make our conquest so costly that we will wish we had never found their planet. And when we finally retreat, they will follow us home. General, I have read about humans who spent their last moments comforting others. I have studied soldiers who carried dead friends for days rather than leave them behind. I have analyzed civilians who chose torture over betraying strangers. These humans will remember every Velthari who sets foot on their world. They will remember every human who dies in this war, and they will spend however long it takes to develop the technology needed for revenge. They will not stop until every Velthari world is ash. I know this sounds like cowardice. I know it contradicts everything we believe about superior firepower and advanced technology. But I have seen what humans are capable of when they believe their cause is just. Cancel the invasion, find another world to conquer, pretend we never found Earth. Because if we fight these humans, we will lose. Maybe not this year, maybe not in our lifetimes, but eventually, they will make sure of it. Kieran stopped typing. His hands were shaking again. He had written the report that could save 2 species, but he knew it would probably be ignored. General Mortis believed in military force. The invasion fleet was ready. Canceling now would seem like weakness and cowardice. But Kieran had to try. He saved the report and attached all his research files. Thousands of pages of human accounts, battle analyses, and psychological profiles. Evidence that should convince any rational leader to avoid this war. As he prepared to send the report, Kieran remembered one final human story. It was about a prisoner of war named Commander Woo Jin Ha who had been captured during the Korean War. Commander Ha had been tortured for information about troop movements. When he refused to talk, his captors had threatened to execute other prisoners. Ha had offered to give them false information instead. He had spent weeks providing his captors with detailed but incorrect intelligence. By the time they realized they had been deceived, Ha had helped dozens of prisoners escape and had saved countless lives on both sides by misdirecting enemy attacks. When his captors finally discovered the deception, they had beaten him nearly to death. But Ha had smiled through his broken teeth and said, "You asked for information. I gave you exactly what you deserved." He had turned his own capture into a victory for his side. That was what humans were like. They could turn any situation to their advantage if they had enough time and determination, and they always had both. Kieran sent his report to General Mortis and copied it to the High Command. Within hours, he would know whether his own people were wise enough to listen. He walked to the window and looked up at the stars. Somewhere in that darkness was a small blue planet full of creatures who had never lost a war because they had never accepted defeat as final. Tomorrow, the Velthari would decide whether to wake those creatures up. Kieran prayed they would choose wisdom over conquest. He prayed they would choose survival over pride. He prayed they would understand that some enemies were too dangerous to fight, no matter how primitive they appeared. But as he watched the invasion fleet's lights moving across the sky, Kieran feared that his people had already made their choice, and if they had, then both species would pay the price for Velthari arrogance. The humans would make sure of that. His computer beeped. A message from General Mortis appeared on the screen. Report received. Fleet launches at dawn. Prepare for victory celebration. Kieran closed his eyes and felt his courage finally break completely. The war was about to begin, and somewhere on a distant blue planet, 7 billion humans were about to show the galaxy why they had never truly lost a fight. God help them all.